Now, senior politicians, including Matt Hancock, are set to appear before the COVID inquiry this week. Regional mayors, including Sadiq Khan of London and Andy Burnham of Manchester, are appearing today. Well, to discuss what we're hoping to find out at the COVID inquiry today in more detail, I'm joined by Carl Hennigan, Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford, and someone who's actually appeared as a witness himself, although didn't actually get to discuss much sensible stuff during that time. I'm wondering if we're getting anything more sensible this time round. Good morning to you, Carl.
Good morning, Julia.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, let's have a little watch and listen to what London Mayor Sadiq Khan has had to say, because he was asked by Andrew O'Connor, KC, one of the counsels to the inquiry, whether he sort of was getting enough information from the government at the beginning of the COVID pandemic back in February 2020. And here's what he had to say.
You'd have expected the government speaking to me, by government I mean ostensibly Downing Street, because we now know in February there were Cobra meetings taking place. We knew nothing about these. We are the capital city. We know what happened. Had we been aware of some of the things that the government were concerned about in February or March, we could have taken preventative action.
He wasn't given enough information. I think pretty much lots of people weren't given enough information. But is this relevant to the terms of reference, which is about basically finding out how we had decision-making and how we got into the lockdowns and all of the other policies?
Well, look, the pandemic lasted about 3 years, and we talked about that for the whole 3 years, Julia. I think we're going to be talking about this inquiry for the next 3 years if we're looking
30.
at what's going on. And as these politicians have come on today, I think what they're doing is, again, blaming everybody else. I didn't have enough information. But it's interesting. I think he did make a good point. He said, well, if you've got Wales and Scotland in the room, why haven't you got London? Because the population's greater for London than it is of both of those two
because
countries.
we know why. Because London is part of England and therefore was covered. The thing is, he says in February he didn't know how serious it was. Well, he should have been watching and listening to my show, because we were talking about how serious it was in February. I've got tweets and clips from my show back in February 2020. We were discussing this and talking about how people keep themselves safe and how it was elderly people and vulnerable people who were at risk and what people needed to do. I mean, again, never didn't take this disease seriously. He just wasn't paying attention.
I think everybody says they want skin in the game and they wanted to be in the meetings, but I think these meetings will be so large they'd actually become, they wouldn't actually function. And therefore, the key, I think, for what Sadiq Khan is saying is he had the answer, that we should have locked down earlier. That's what I've heard him say this morning. And if he'd have been in the room, he could have made that point clearer. But I want you to remember, I think we have to remember, until we came to this pandemic, lockdowns were never in the plan. They were never in the pandemic planning.
Why weren't they in the plan, Carl?
Well, because nobody had ever shown their work. In the previous 10 pandemics, we thought they were a seriously bad idea because the harms would outweigh the benefits. And therefore, it was only because China went into a lockdown that suddenly everybody panicked into it. And now, despite the fact we had 200 policy interventions in 2020, people are coming forward and saying, if only we'd had 201, which was with a lockdown a week early, or we'd have had intermittent lockdowns. So what these people want is more and more interventions on the basis that they say their intervention would have worked with no evidence.
If only they'd done it 2 days earlier or a week earlier or 1 day longer or more people involved. And this is the extraordinary thing when you think about lockdowns and the tiers. And as we know, some of these some of other cities like Manchester and others, were in lockdowns for longer periods. There's simply no evidence that they saved lives in the long run. And we are seeing the fallout from this zero COVID attempt, this lockdown policy in China. Right now, they are seeing their hospitals inundated with people with various different, lung diseases, breathing diseases, because, of course, this is their first winter post-lockdown and having locked everyone away for 3 years.
So I think you're right, Julie, creating this problem of a susceptible population because you try and keep them away from virus infections, particularly children. We've seen that with RSV, and it's not just us. They're seeing this problem around the world. You heard this week about China's mysterious pneumonia. It isn't that mysterious. As they've opened up, they've got all of these viruses that are coming back like RSV that are causing a wave of pneumonia. But I think what's interesting about this week, and there are only about 7 more days after this week to go, is the politicians are coming at the end. And what this will give them is an opportunity to see what everybody's said about them and prepare a defense. I suspect Matt Hancock will be coming out on the attack, as will Boris and Rishi, to turn around and go, oh, hold on a minute. If the advice was poor, it was actually poorly communicated to us. And next time we need to do a better job. And perhaps we do need better advisors in the room who can communicate the uncertainties and represent a wider spectrum of the problem, particularly what's going on in the community on the ground.
And some of the most shocking evidence we have seen, where it has been more than just tittle tattle and people being abusive and utter nonsense that's totally irrelevant to the terms of the actual inquiry, what we have learned is basically, you know, there wasn't a lot of evidence for a lot of the things that they came up with. A lot of things were just decided on a whim. Well, this might work. They weren't examining the data. Politicians didn't understand a lot of the data, but also it appears a lot of the scientists didn't. And even when some scientists, some senior figures in the government did say we need to have some sort of analysis of the impact of these policies in other areas and on other people, like education, like you know, social care or whatever, and the economy, a small point. It was never done. And people like me, really early on, and politicians, numerous people were saying, you know, and scientists like your good self and others, Sunetra Gupta and others, were saying we need to have just some sort of analysis of what the downside is of some of these policies. But again, it was all about saving people from COVID and nothing else mattered. And now these very same people are all on the news going, oh, isn't it terrible? All these children have got eating disorders because they were locked in their homes for 2 years. Isn't it awful? All these people are facing all these economic problems, as if it's got nothing to do with it. But it was predicted and predictable.
So I think what we're seeing is a philosophical difference between medicine and mathematical modelling. In mathematical modelling, you use that to predict the future with some certainty, and then you say, we do these things and everything will get better. But those in medicine understand the uncertainties and the complexity of what happens next. It's very hard sometimes to predict what's going to happen. So what you need to do is have a cost-benefit analysis of the benefits and the harms and weigh those up. And when they're uncertain, what you should do is say, well, let's test these. Let's do some trials of maths, for instance, in schools. Do they really add up? Does it make a difference? But what we've done is completely failed to do that. So when we sat here and the inquiry's going, what have we actually learned in terms of MPIs? What we've learned is a lot of people have a lot of opinions about what they think they should work. And they have those opinions with some certainty, which is not reflected in the evidence base. And I think that's the key issue. Medicine is complex, healthcare is complex, and to understand how to interpret evidence and what to do next, you need an evidence base. And at the moment, we're completely lacking it.
Absolutely. Carl Hennigan, it's always a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you very much indeed.